What if the single most important trade link in North America just stopped? Not because of an accident or a protest, but because of a deliberate political decision. Imagine the breaking news alert. The Ambassador Bridge is now closed by Canadian authorities. The first reaction would be confusion. The second would be panic. Assembly lines in Detroit, which rely on parts arriving just hours before they're needed, would go quiet. Grocery stores in Toronto, expecting fresh produce from California, would see their shelves start to empty. And in Washington, D.C. and Ottawa, a political firestorm would erupt between two of the world's closest allies. This isn't just about a bridge. It's a story about the shocking fragility of our modern world, and what happens when a 7,500-foot span of steel is turned into a weapon. The economic heartbeat of the region wouldn't just slow down. It would suffer a massive heart attack. To really get the scale of this, you have to understand that the Ambassador Bridge isn't just a bridge. For nearly a century, it's been one of the most important pieces of infrastructure on the continent. Opened back in 1929, this link between Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan, is the physical symbol of the integrated North American economy. It's consistently been the busiest international truck crossing between the U.S. and Canada. Now, you'll often hear an old statistic that the bridge carries 25% of all trade between the two countries. That number is a bit outdated and high. Today, it's closer to 20% of surface trade. But even with that correction, the numbers are wild. On an average day, hundreds of millions of dollars in goods flow across its 4 lanes. That's a constant stream of auto parts, electronics, food, and medical supplies. A study from way back in 2004, so these numbers are old, found that 150,000 jobs in the Detroit-Windsor area and billions in production depended directly on this one crossing. But what makes the scenario of a government blockade so explosive is who owns it. The Ambassador Bridge is privately owned. For decades, it was controlled by the famously combative billionaire Matty Moran, who fought tooth and nail against any attempt to build a public alternative. After his death in 2020, the bridge remains in his family's hands through the Detroit International Bridge Company and its Canadian counterpart, the Canadian Transit Company. This means a government can't just decide to close it. It's a private business, wrapped up in international agreements and property rights. A Canadian government trying to shut it down wouldn't just be making a policy choice. It would be directly intervening against a private company, guaranteeing a storm of lawsuits and outrage from the business community. The bridge's own design used to be a major vulnerability. For years, trucks coming into Canada were funneled directly onto the city streets of West Windsor, creating a natural bottleneck. That situation has been hugely improved with the Herb Gray Parkway, which now connects the crossing directly to the main highway. But the memory of that choke point and how simple it was to block was driven home during the Freedom Convoy protests in February 2022. That blockade, led by private citizens, was a real-world test of what happens when the artery is clamped shut. The economic damage was instant and severe. It was a wake-up call for everyone, from CEOs to politicians, showing that the hyper-efficient global economy was balanced on a knife's edge. And in our hypothetical scenario set in mid-2026, there's one more piece on the board. The brand new Gordie Howe International Bridge. After decades of delays, this massive 6-lane public bridge is finally open. It provides a backup, a pressure release valve that never existed before. But as we're about to see, you can't just reroute an entire continent's logistics overnight. Even with a second bridge, deliberately closing the Ambassador would still be an act of economic self-destruction that would trigger an immediate and devastating crisis. The second the bridge is blocked, a timer starts. Not in days, but in hours. The first and biggest domino to fall would be the North American auto industry, which would grind to a halt. That's not an exaggeration. It's the direct result of just-in-time manufacturing. Car companies have spent decades perfecting a system where they don't stockpile parts. Instead, parts are shipped from a supplier to arrive at the factory just hours before they're bolted onto a car. It's incredibly efficient, but also incredibly fragile. The Ambassador Bridge is the main conveyor belt for this system. It connects Ontario's part makers with assembly plants in Michigan, Ohio, and beyond. During the 2022 blockade, we saw what happens when that conveyor belt stops. Within hours, plants started shutting down. Ford, GM, Toyota, and Honda all cut production. An engine plant in Ohio had to close. One economic group estimated automakers lost nearly $300 million, while workers lost out on around $145 million in wages. The Canadian auto parts industry pegged its own daily losses at $50 million. In our scenario of a deliberate government shutdown, the impact would be even worse because there's no ambiguity. It's a hostile act. Companies would immediately start laying people off. And it's not just the big guys. It's the thousands of smaller companies that make the little things, the bolts, the brackets, the plastic bits. For them, a week-long shutdown could be a death sentence. But the pain wouldn't stop at the auto sector. Take Canada's food supply in the winter. A lot of fresh fruit and vegetables from California and Florida cross the border at Windsor. A blockade means trucks full of lettuce, berries, and tomatoes are stuck. Some could try to reroute, but much of it would simply rot. The result? Shortages in grocery stores and price spikes for whatever is available. Then there are medical supplies. Transport Canada has noted the significant volume of pharmaceuticals and medical equipment that uses this crossing. A shutdown could delay time-sensitive medicines and vital hospital gear. The numbers are hard to wrap your head around. During the week-long 2022 protest, the total value of halted trade was estimated in the billions. In our hypothetical state-led blockade, the psychological damage would be just as bad. The stock market would likely react badly, especially for manufacturing and logistics companies. The cost to insure anything crossing the border would spike, if you could even get insurance. Closing the bridge would be like throwing a crowbar into the gears of a finely tuned machine, causing an immediate cascading failure across the North American economy. As the economy seizes up, a political crisis would explode. The U.S.-Canada relationship is often seen as the friendliest in the world. Deliberately blocking the Ambassador Bridge would tear that image to shreds. First, why would Canada ever do this? It would have to be an act of sheer desperation, a nuclear option in a major diplomatic fight. Maybe it's retaliation against crippling U.S. tariffs during the 2026 review of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. Whatever the reason, it's like pulling the pin on a grenade in a small room. The White House reaction would be instant fury. The president would be on the phone with the Prime Minister demanding one thing: open the bridge. Now. The U.S. sees its supply chain as a national security issue. An intentional disruption by its closest ally would be viewed as a hostile act against American jobs and the U.S. economy. Meanwhile, in Canada, the Prime Minister would be fighting a war on three fronts. First, the legal chaos. The bridge's owners would immediately sue the government, claiming it was an illegal seizure of their private property. This would launch a massive legal battle over the limits of government power. Second, the government would need a legal reason for the closure. This is where it gets really murky. During the 2022 protests, the government used the Emergencies Act. But that act is meant for threats to national security that the government is trying to solve, not a crisis it created. Imagine a government declaring an emergency to justify its own policy. It would likely spark a constitutional crisis. Third, the political infighting. The Premier of Ontario would be in an impossible spot. With the provincial economy tanking, there would be immense pressure to defy the federal government and reopen the bridge, which could lead to a hypothetical standoff between federal and provincial police. Internationally, Canada's reputation as a stable, reliable place to do business would take a massive hit. It would signal that Canada is willing to weaponize its infrastructure, making foreign investors think twice for years to come. The political fallout would be a self-inflicted wound of historic proportions, creating a diplomatic rupture with the U.S. that could take a generation to fix. By day 3, the shock would settle into a grim reality. The obvious solution, just reroute everything, would turn into a logistical nightmare. All eyes would turn to the other crossings, mainly the Blue Water Bridge to the north, Sarnia-Port Huron, and the Peace Bridge to the south, Fort Erie-Buffalo. But these bridges simply aren't designed to absorb all of the ambassador's traffic. We saw this in 2022. They get overwhelmed almost immediately. Trucks would be backed up for miles and miles. The phrase 100-mile-long traffic jam might sound like an exaggeration, but it would start to feel very real on highways in both Ontario and Michigan. A trip that normally takes a few hours could become a multi-day ordeal. This isn't just an inconvenience. For truckers, time is money. Drivers are limited by law in how many hours they can work. If they spend all day stuck in traffic, they've accomplished nothing. Fuel costs would soar as thousands of trucks idle. The cost of shipping anything across the border would explode, and that cost gets passed on to consumers. It's a disruption tax on the entire continent. As the crisis drags on, we'd hit a political point of no return. The demands from Washington would turn into open threats of an economic war. The U.S. has a long list of painful options it could use in retaliation. It could slap heavy tariffs on Canadian goods like lumber and steel. It could even do something previously unthinkable, like starting a work-to-rule campaign at all other border crossings, where customs agents inspect every single vehicle, choking off all trade without officially closing the border. This pressure would cause deep cracks in Canada. The western provinces, which depend on selling oil and crops to the U.S., would be furious with Ottawa. Quebec's integrated economy would be cratering. The Prime Minister's career would be on the line. The U.S. would be hurting too. The supply chain pain is a boomerang that hits American workers and consumers hard. But in this game of chicken, the question is who blinks first. The American economy is bigger and more diverse. The Canadian economy is overwhelmingly dependent on trade with the U.S. The crisis would have escalated from a logistics headache to a full-blown economic conflict with no easy way out. In the middle of all this chaos, all hope would turn to that massive new structure just down the river, the Gordie Howe International Bridge. By mid-2026, this 6-lane publicly owned bridge is operational, designed for the exact purpose of preventing this kind of crisis. It's the only real path out of the immediate economic death spiral. But you can't just flip a switch and divert everything. The logistics world runs on contracts and established routes. Trucking companies have deals with the Ambassador Bridge. Their software is programmed for its customs plaza. Shifting that entire ecosystem, which took decades to build, to a brand new bridge takes time to do smoothly. The Gordie Howe would immediately become the main relief valve. Its modern freeway-to-freeway design would handle traffic far better than the old bridge's city street exits, but it would still be overwhelmed. The bridge authority would be in crisis mode, but they can't magically create more customs officers. Delays would still be huge, just not as apocalyptic as the gridlock elsewhere. Its existence would prevent a total shutdown of trade, keeping a trickle of goods flowing, which is infinitely better than nothing. The real long-term resolution, though, would be a fundamental rewiring of the North American economy. This crisis would be a brutal, multi-billion-dollar lesson in the danger of being too efficient. For 30 years, just in time was the gospel. This blockade would prove that just in time can quickly become just too late. In the aftermath, companies would be forced to shift their thinking. The new mantra would become just in case. Businesses would start spending billions to build resilience, more warehouses to hold extra inventory as a buffer, and diversifying their shipping routes. A company that once only used the Ambassador Bridge would now have backup plans for the Gordie Howe, the Blue Water Bridge, and even rail or air. This shift isn't free. Holding more inventory is expensive. Building in redundancy is, by definition, less efficient. Those costs would get baked into the price of everything, meaning we would all pay a bit more for cars, electronics, and food. The era of maximum efficiency at the lowest possible cost would give way to a new era that values stability. Politically, assuming Canada eventually backs down, the trust between the two countries would be shattered. The 2026 trade agreement review would become a bitter negotiation. The U.S. would likely demand new rules to prevent critical infrastructure from ever being used as a political weapon again. Having stared into the economic abyss, Canada would have very little power to say no. This whole hypothetical scenario is a powerful reminder of a simple truth. Our modern way of life is built on systems that are way more fragile than we think. We've optimized our world for peak efficiency, and in the process, we've created single points of failure that can cause a catastrophic collapse. A single bridge, less than 2 miles long, has the power to disrupt the economy of a continent and spark a crisis between the world's closest allies. The economic cost would be in the billions, but the cost to trust and stability would be impossible to calculate. Even with the new Gordie Howe Bridge providing a crucial backup, weaponizing the Ambassador Bridge would cause immense damage. It proves that redundancy isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. The crisis would force a painful rethinking of the just-in-time philosophy that has run our world for decades. The Ambassador Bridge is just one example. What do you think is the biggest vulnerability in our global supply chain today? A canal? A specific computer chip factory? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. It's a conversation we all need to be having.